Hello there and welcome back to Sultan Sanctuary. Today we're going from one annoying area, Hager's Cavern, into another. But before we get around to doing that, we're going to get some new gear. We're wearing the merchant set, which is probably one of the worst armor sets in the game. It provides nearly no defense, which does make sense, given it's meant for a merchant conducting deals, not someone engaged in battle. And we're going to use a new weapon, not the Tachi, not the Shikemaru, but the Flint and Steel, a Class 2 Flint Razor, the only Flint Razor weapon in the game. If you want to wield it, you need to be able to use Class 2 swords, by the way. So, at first glance, there's nothing particularly special about the Flint Razor. It's a normal sword with a normal sword moveset, it can be two-handed, you can equip charms to it. Nothing out of the ordinary. But if you check what you can equip in your secondary slot when you have it equipped in your primary, you realize, oh, I can actually equip ammunition. Now this forces you to two-hand the weapon, but in exchange your heavy attack instead becomes a gunfire blast, thus giving you both melee and ranged capability, well, medium ranged, with a single weapon. And that makes the Flint and Steel both unique and surprisingly useful. Damage-wise, it can actually end up far surpassing any of the other guns if you have especially high dexterity, and stack damage modifiers, charms that add damage to your weapon attacks, which also boost the damage of the gunfire, as well as weapon buffs. Now, unfortunately, you won't be seeing especially high damage capability in this video, as we don't really have the dexterity or just the overall buffs to really make that work. But you can see a little bit of it in various encounters here where I buff the weapon with Arcane Weapon, and it makes its shots a fair bit stronger. Either way, even if the weapon isn't always necessarily the best choice, it is a very fun weapon to play around with. And it's a shame that there aren't more unique weapons like this, or this Steel Centipede that we used earlier. That would do a lot to increase the overall weapon variety in the game, considering the fact that if you have one of a class of weapon, in another they're virtually identical aside from their stats. But this is a let's play, not a review, so let's continue discussing matters at hand, such as these goddamn motherfucking angsty bones. Oh my god. We're still dealing with them on our escape from Hager's Cavern. And unfortunately, I can't say that we'll be completely free from teleporting skeletons in the future, as the next area has the Archer variants. Fortunately, it does not have the melee ones, who, as I've gone over before, are far and away the most annoying, but still, a way too overused enemy type for how annoying they are to deal with. Thankfully, that's pretty much it. We've reached the end of Hager's Cavern. Sadly, what awaits us is nothing good, as we enter the Mire of Stench. And for no real reason, I decide to equip antidotes to our hotbar. A bloated monstrosity being protected by a Heartseeker. No thanks, game, especially since they're not actually guarding anything useful. So, if it weren't obvious, the main gimmick of this area is poison and traps that sometimes cause poison, sometimes cause death. The entire bottom of this mire is a poisonous swamp that quickly builds up poison. And if you don't cure it, it will stack the poison. As I mentioned earlier, any poison effect can stack with itself, which drastically boosts the damage. Thankfully, the game is lenient enough to actually give you a poison defense boosting ring pretty much immediately. And it is a pretty significant boost to your poison defenses. So, one reason that the Flint and Steel especially comes in handy here is that the range of it is just long enough to allow you to destroy a lot of the traps, turrets and whatnot that will end up firing arrows at you, which makes dealing with the platforming a lot easier. Now, you don't need the Flint and Steel by any means. Any gun, or a crossbow, or even a bow, or magic for that matter, would do just fine. But I wanted to show off the Flint and Steel here, and I figured it would be the best area to do so. Especially since the enemies here are relatively non-threatening, although that doesn't mean I don't get utterly destroyed by them in several instances. Even though the enemies here are quite squishy and thus are relatively poor damage with the Flint and Steel doesn't matter, they're also incredibly fast, and the fact that we are forced to two-hand the Flint and Steel to use its ranged option really hinders us. The swing speed is just slow enough that they can easily interrupt us out of our own attacks and start going ham on us. If we don't attack from our maximum range, that is. For this area, it would definitely be ideal to have a very quick weapon in one of your loadouts, or a weapon with very long reach. Either one will trump their speed. Here I end up poring over each of these stone idols that we have, to see if any of the effects that they provide would help us, and unfortunately none of them are especially worthwhile. I was hoping that one might have given a boost to poison defense or something like that I had forgotten about, but unfortunately that was not the case. So these two messages here hint at a rather annoyingly hidden secret. As they pretty directly state, there is a secret off to the left, but it is after a long trek through the swamp. And in addition to poisoning you, the swamp greatly lowers your movement speed. So you pretty much have to hop and skip your way over to the secret to reduce the amount of poison that's being built up on you, while occasionally using antidotes. If you fail to adequately deal with this situation, then you will end up stacking several poison effects on yourself, and you will very quickly die as the poison damage will outpace any healing you could possibly hope to muster. But actually taking the effort to come over to this area is very well worth it, as we encounter a new NPC. He's not the most wordy fellow, which does make sense given he's living alone by himself in a danky, poisonous swamp. But he is very useful to us, as long as we say that we're fond of him. He is actually another merchant, and potentially a pretty useful one if you're currently unable to access Minty Skell's inventory, as he sells the most basic type of the fire and frozen upgrade material line. Otherwise, the majority of what he sells is poison-related items. Cures for poison, as well as a variety of ways to inflict poison. Throwable knives, buffs for your weapons, poisonous arrows, etc. However, his most useful selection is his armor. He sells not only his rags, but this incredibly fancy purple velvet set, which is one of my favorite looking sets in the game. It is just so wonderfully dandy. And it actually provides some decent defenses as opposed to our current merchant set, so we're going to be switching over to that immediately. This will pretty much ensure that we never get poisoned, even if we get hit by a whole bunch of poison attacks. And again, it looks really, really sweet. More appropriate for a mage than anything else, but hey, we do have magic in our second loadout, so it's still fitting. So using a bell to return to the sanctuary rather than making the long trek back, let's continue with exploring this poisonous hellhole. So as I mentioned before, the flint and steel is excellent at destroying traps, so that way you can trip their wires without any fear. However, it is less good at dealing with these enemies here, whose names I don't quite remember. But as you can see, if you get too close to them thanks to the slow swing speed of the two-handed sword moveset, they will proceed to stun lock you and do a fair bit of damage, despite the fact that their single attacks don't exactly do all that much. That is going to be a common sight in this video, me getting owned by those poisonous jerks. So get used to it. The Mire Heart charm that we just picked up is a charm that adds poison to our attacks. Now, you may be saying, didn't we get a charm that did that earlier? And yes. However, this one applies a stronger poison effect, at the cost of also poisoning you whenever you swing your weapon. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword. And if the allusions to Blighttown from Dark Souls weren't any more obvious, they even have a wheel-based elevator. Unfortunately, this one is not powered by a small flaming pupper, so it's not quite as good. Okay, I decided to actually look up this enemy type's name, and it is Leprous. And according to its bestiary entry, there's a bestiary in this game by the way, I should probably show that off at some point. They are infected with Grey Rot, the same disease that afflicts the people of the House of Splendor, and they've even developed a religion around it. As I mentioned so long ago, while the majority of the lore and background stuff in this game isn't super interesting, there are some cool tidbits. Heading back this way just to check this out. Yeah, that fatty bag of teeth and arms up there is going to be our boss of the day. But unfortunately our way to him is currently blocked, so we're gonna have to figure out a way to fix that. Here we see the return of an enemy type that we got a sneak preview of much earlier, the Saltless, and they are just as dangerous as they were back then. So spamming them to death to stunlock them is the order of the day. Although they are hidden, they tell of their presence by their ghastly moans, so we know there are some nearby. And here's a good example of why they are so dangerous. If you don't manage to stunlock them, they will stunlock you with their potions, which in addition to doing a fair amount of damage, debuff all of your defenses, making you take even more damage. More so than almost any other enemy type, they veer sharply from being completely pathetic to incredibly lethal, depending on how well you end up dealing with them. Over here, we end up picking up the Corsair set, that of the pirates that we fought back at the beginning and a little bit in Hager's Cavern. In comparison to the much more dangerous Leprous, these new fly enemies are pretty damn tame. They're weak and they're not all that aggressive, and even if they do hit you, they don't do too much damage. They're more of a meat shield for the actually dangerous enemies, like the Leprous or the Archers. I told you we'd be seeing these guys again. Thankfully, they are a breath of fresh air compared to their melee-based cousins. One downside to the Flint and Steel is that because its strong attack is firing your gun, you can't actually do a drop attack like you could with any other sword. So if you drop an enemy below you, you can't plunge down on it and do a lot of damage, which is a little bit unfortunate. This just takes us back to the currently locked boss room. This is an alternate way of approaching. And right here, there is a chest up there, but we can't quite reach it. We simply don't have the jump height, and going to the lowest equip load tier would not help us. We will need some sort of movement upgrade to actually get up there. I believe it might be possible to force your way up there if you jump just right and give yourself a bit more air distance by swinging a light weapon in the air. That's actually something I'll be showing off later to make another jump that would require a movement upgrade earlier. But even if it is possible there, I'm not going to attempt it because that would be too much of a time investment. We'll just head back there once we have that movement upgrade. This here is probably the worst encounter I have with the Leprous, so I just choose to let them kill themselves. Seems a pretty effective strategy. And then we can just mop up the flies. With this piece here, this is a good example of just how weak the Flint and Steel is in our hands. The flies, as I mentioned before, don't really have all that much in the way of health, but it still took us a while to take down that one. It is a weapon that is heavily dependent on having high dexterity, as well as buffs applied to it to deal a good amount of damage. Not that that is strictly a bad thing, as because having less than optimal damage does show off a more honest view of the game. The difficulty that we're having here with the enemies in the Mire of Stench, despite them not being all that dangerous, is more similar to what you'd have going through this area on your first playthrough of the game. Anywho, this shrine here leads back to Hager's Cavern to the other side of a one-way shortcut door that we saw. Like most of these, it serves almost no practical purpose, so they give us an additional reward in the form of a new spell, Venomous Blade, that buffs our weapon with poison. Perhaps we'll be checking that out in the future. We acquire a new charm, the Red Hair Charm, but not without serious risk, thanks to an ambush by the Split Swordsman here, who, much like the Leprous, are quick enough that our two-handed sword is not terribly effective versus them. So let's just head back to our shrine and reset this encounter. Better than dying after all. And just to make the comparison perfectly clear, let's try one-handing our Flint and Steel, and see how the encounter goes this time. not even using any additional buffs to get additional damage, just the raw flint and raw steel. It goes much better. This just goes to show you just how much the flint and steel is crippled by forcing you to two-hand it when you fire its gun, compared to the regular sword moveset at least. Or maybe it's just because I'm less familiar with the two-handed sword because I never used them. Granted, that is because it is a less good moveset, so it's probably a little of column A, a little of column B. We have one more trial before we can get to the switch that will allow us to unlock the path to the boss. 3 flies and a bronze knight, the axe-wielding one, who is, for my money, the most dangerous variant, simply because they have a nasty jumping attack which can be somewhat tricky to parry, so we're going full in on buffs. Doesn't help that, again, our damage with the flint and steel is somewhat low, so we're going to have to parry him more times than we would if we were using a stronger weapon. But still, he goes down pretty quickly. This is not the switch to unlock the boss. That unlocks another path that we currently can't get to. Again, we'll need a movement upgrade before we can access that. And much like the other one, it might be possible to access it if you utilize the jump glitch, but we're not going to bother with that here. Now, however, we can access the boss. So let's buff and get on in there. That Stench Most Foul. That, I gotta say, is a pretty damn good boss name. So, the Stench Most Foul is not especially dangerous. A lot of what he likes to do early on is spawn these smaller versions of himself that go down in a few hits, even if you don't have the best damage output. As long as you can keep up the pace in killing them and prevent him from filling the screen with them, things stay plenty manageable. When you reduce his health enough, he starts throwing out new attacks, such as that very short-range AoE, and this fairly nasty poisonous breath. It doesn't do too much in the way of damage, it's certainly not nearly as fearsome as the Kraken Worm's Fire Breath, but it does build up poison fairly quickly if you don't have especially high poison defense. The attack also carries quite a way across the screen, so it can be difficult to avoid getting hit by it. The only other moves that the Stench Most Foul has available to him are some melee moves that he does when he's close to the ground, but he does those so rarely that this playthrough here is the first time that I've ever actually seen him use them, and they're not that difficult to avoid. This guy is pretty much just a huge sack of HP and could barely be called a boss. He'd be much more appropriate as a mini-boss, I think. If you want to take him down as quickly as possible, he is weakest to fire damage and holy damage. So buffing your weapon with those is definitely the way to go, or casting fire magic if you have it. But yeah, that's the Stench Most Foul. Not really all that impressive of a boss, but it's a pretty cool design. And again, a really great and really apt name. But of course, we still have a ways to go there. We're actually nearly out of the Mire of Stench, so we'll actually be heading into and completing a new area. A very small area, but a new area nonetheless. This new ring that we picked up increases our stamina regeneration, and is a pretty handy replacement for our poison defense boosting ring, since we're no longer going to have to deal with so much poison. Heading up through this second wheel elevator, we come to yet another NPC. This one by a bonfire. You know what that means. This here is a hunter of special beasts. And she has information on these red barriers that we've been seeing. They are called redshift, and can be cut through with torchlight if you possess the necessary brand. Yes, we would like the brand. Now our way forward is barred by naught. Well, naught but platforming. We won't be able to get everywhere until we pick up the last brand, which is the movement upgrade that I mentioned earlier. And you may actually be surprised as to what the movement upgrade is. Given that this is a Metroidvania, you may think that it is a double jump, and you might be correct, but it also might be something else. Anyway, she just continues to talk about the blood brows and how centuries ago they created redshift barriers to house all sorts of nasty monsters that could not be killed. And that it is rather odd to see redshift barriers up here because the secret to creating them was lost a long time ago, meaning that a blood brow from long ago must have been here. And that's all she has to say. Begone, vile barrier, you shall impede us no longer. It's interesting to note that, strictly speaking, you don't need to acquire the redshift brand to complete the game. There is another pathway through Hager's Cavern that ends up leading out to here. We could go through it backwards, but we won't today. We're just going to pick up this reward at the end of it. But if you elect to leave Hager's Cavern through that pathway, you can skip not only the boss of Hager's Cavern, but the entirety of the Mire of Stench, and you never actually need to remove any redshift barriers to actually complete the game. Now, I wouldn't recommend skipping picking up the redshift brand, because there are quite a few areas locked behind it with useful items and bosses to kill and all sorts of fun game content. But it's interesting to note how something that seems so vital is in fact completely optional. Now, what we're doing here is switching our gear loadout. The upcoming enemy, the Dread Horseman I believe they're called, maybe Dread Rider, something similar to that, is a rather nasty foe, who is most easily dealt with parrying. As such, we want a weapon that not only can parry, but can also provide a powerful riposte. Probably the most notable thing is that you can parry him while he's on his horse, although you won't do a complete critical animation, you'll just do a half one, and then he'll immediately get up, like if you were using a scythe against any other enemy. Once you've done enough damage to him, you'll kill his horse, and that's when he becomes truly dangerous. He is, for my money, one of the hardest enemies in the game to parry, and his attacks are very strong, and if you let him, he will just bat you about the place and combo you to no end, and very, very quickly kill you. Like other heavy knight enemies, he pretty much always keeps up his shield and has such heavy armor that you can't really stun him easily when he actually lowers his shield. He'll probably end up hitting you first and knocking you away. So if you can't parry or you're not good at parrying, I would actually just recommend skipping past him. He's tough in battle but quite slow, so it shouldn't be difficult to get away. Thankfully we managed to take him down, which means we're free to kill these rotten raiders that spawn up. These guys aren't especially dangerous, they're not very strong and they're not very aggressive, but they're very difficult to stun. Even with a heavy weapon, you require at least 2 swings, and they do attack quickly enough that if you don't attack from your maximum range, they will likely stun you before you can get your second hit off and actually stun them. Again, not dangerous, but kind of annoying to deal with, and they can totally kill you if you end up phasing out and don't pay proper attention. Much like the Dread Knight, for many builds it might be optimal just to run past them. It's not like they can follow you all that far. I'll be completely honest, I really don't get this message here. Like, when I hear I am the Knight, I think of Batman, and that armor set doesn't really look like Batman's. I feel like I'm just completely missing the joke that it's just flying whoosh over my head. Perhaps one of you, my dear viewers, is more knowledgeable and could elaborate on that matter. Anyway, the main reason to bother exploring the Fort Beyond the Mire to any serious degree is the fact that it contains the only sanctuary in the game that belongs to the Iron Men creed. Iron Ones, rather, although if there was a creed based around Iron Man, that would be pretty awesome. So if you don't choose to start the game as an Iron One, it was one of the 3 initial creed choices offered to you by that salt-soaked man, this is the only way that you can join. Unfortunately, at this point in the game, it's not really worth joining. The House of Splendor is just a superior overall creed. So earlier on I mentioned that there would be one place we could get to with some items, that normally at this point we would not be able to, but instead we employ a little bit of fidgety platforming to do it early. And this is that example. If we equip a light weapon that can attack many times in the air and then wall jump, and then immediately attack, we can actually force ourselves over to the ledge and just barely grab onto it. Hey, message, I did indeed get good. Unfortunately, the reward is not all that amazing, but hey, this means we don't have to return here once we pick up that movement upgrade. Not to mention that one of the more fun things you can do in an exploration-based Metroidvania, in my opinion, is to figure out dumb shortcuts like these, even if they're not necessarily useful. And again, we have a similar message to the one we saw before. This boatman here wearing the same armor set as was in that chest. I really don't get whatever joke is being made there. Well, either way, we are done with the Fort Beyond the Mire. I told you that it was a short area. The boatman is instead taking us east, despite the fact that we're going to the left side of the screen. I mean, technically it's a 2D plane, so east and west can be in whatever direction the developers decide, but that's just a little bit confusing. Anyway, he took us here to the far beach where, hey, it's our buddy, the Despondent Thief. How you doing there? Yeah, this would be a pretty good place to craft a seaworthy skiff. Oh, well, you're welcome. I enjoyed your company as well. She would like to take us with her, but she does not know if it's going to be safe, so she would not feel comfortable doing that. And besides, we do have to try and find our princess, even if she does turn out to be a slave. The thief, however, does give us a little bit of treasure, the highest tier of upgrade material for the Frozen line. And she gives us a tip as to how to locate her in the outside world, should we make it off of this island ourselves. And unfortunately, that is the last we'll be seeing of the Despondent Thief. We can only hope that she manages to make it off this island alive. Let's raise a toast to her good fortune at this sanctuary here, now that we have some wine. But with that, I think we'll leave it off, and we'll explore the rest of the far beach here next time.